Did you hear about the gender gap and gender pay gap growing? They just announced it recently. So the first time in 20 years, the gender pay gap has increased. Controlling for inflation, male incomes rose 3.5% and females raised only 1.5%. And they cited two professions as the culprits of stagnating wages, not keeping up with inflation. One was nursing, and the other one was teaching. I mean, we just can't afford the things the teachers used to be able to pay. They used to be able to buy a house. They used to be able to put their kids through college. They can't do those things anymore. Yeah. But when you were talking about the teacher preparation and coursework stuff, I mean, you were saying how it's a poor predictor. I think, and you don't have to say this because I know you have higher ups, and I don't. I'm a tenured K-12 teacher. I just don't think that stuff is all that useful. I think it's just onerous and ridiculous. Like, I do think we should be asked to do some preparation, but I don't think what we're doing, especially in California, oh my gosh, it's not helpful. So, of course, if you're, and like you were saying, way overstating the case of they've done all these things, they're highly qualified. No, 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 no. It's all superficial and ridiculous, right? Like, how much are you willing to say about that?
First, can I ask a follow-up on, you mentioned things in California specifically. Are there specific requirements of teachers that you feel like are particularly egregious?
Yeah, induction. Induction is a postgraduate requirement of 2 additional years that teachers actually in Los Angeles have to pay for. In my district, I didn't have to pay for it, but if I couldn't, there was an option to pay for it. And so if you do pay for it, those units get added to step and column. And I could not afford them, and so they didn't get added to my step and column. So you get paid more for having more money and being married to a wealthy spouse or having generational wealth. Induction is not helpful. The Cal TPAs are not helpful. And now administrators have to do the Cal APAs, not helpful. And administrator induction, not helpful. And other states, they don't have to. Do you know what these are, Paul? I'm sorry, I'm using these terms like you know, but I don't know that you know.
I know some of them, and for the rest, I think I can get the gist. So I think I'm with you in general in terms of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think these are very relevant things to be talking about in a conversation about teacher shortages. Just as framing, I think if for anyone who is concerned for any reason about there being shortages of teachers, or you even mentioned administrators to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you absolutely have to at least reflect on the question of how hard do we make it to even be allowed to do the job.
Amen. Amen.
Um, and I think so. So I think those are important questions to ask. And I will say, I think it is. I think the research on this is relatively clear on most of these things. That on average, these things are not making a very big difference. I have not done a careful cost benefit analysis, but my suspicion is that a lot of these activities, these both pre-service and in-service activities, on average, I would not be surprised at all if they were not passing a cost benefit test. And like we've discussed, they are not they might in some cases be a little bit predictive, but they're not on the whole all that useful for identifying who is going to be successful and not. Now, I do want to say, in the defense of some of these things, we talk like induction. I would say if you look at the evidence on the very best induction programs, there's plausible evidence that they are helping teachers modestly, not trivially, not amazingly, but that they are helping with retention and effectiveness. But at the same time, I don't think we should judge these programs based on what the very best programs do. I
Mm,
think, at least as a policy person, I think we might want to learn from the very best programs, but we don't design policy around the assumption that only the best programs are implemented and they're implemented everywhere. And so I think, we need to be thinking a lot more about whether the barriers that we put up for people entering the profession are worth it and whether they are fair to people in the profession. I think I'm also worried about I have some concerns about not just some of the pre-service requirements you mentioned, but also in service, the extent to which we require teachers to accumulate additional education in
yeah.
order to earn higher compensation.
Mm-hmm.
I understand some of the rationale for that, and I'm not super confident that it's not a reasonable approach in a lot of cases. But I do think it's striking the extent to which, they're to get a higher salary, you need more education, and it doesn't particularly matter in a lot of cases what you do to get that education.
Mhm.
That suggests to me that we're not necessarily paying enough attention to whether those things are really worth it or whether that we're just making teachers jump through hoops
That's it.
to get extra pay. I think it is not at all obvious that we've struck the right
That's
balance
it.
there.
That's it. And they're not, the units you can take don't have to be towards a master's degree that gives you like self-possession and agency to be a leader in the profession. It's just jumping through hoops to grab units. And there's no like attention to nuance or authenticity of the education. And there are people just making money off of teachers because teachers have to pay for those units, which is unusual in a credentialed, well, I shouldn't say it's unusual. There are other credentialed professions where they have to pay for their own certifications, but those classes are just not very helpful a lot of times.
Yeah, and I say this as someone, and to be clear, I'm saying this as someone who teaches in endorsement programs, in my case for administrators, but it's something that I take very seriously, which is that, um, you know, that my students in a lot of cases have to go through a program
Mm-hmm.
like mine, and I think there's a real onus on me and any instructor in these programs to make sure that their time is as valuable as possible and that they're learning things as much as possible and that we're not making their lives even harder for no reason. And I don't know that as a field we've done enough to reflect critically on that, but I do think it's something that weighs on me, and
Oh,
that we should be thinking more about as a profession.
you're one of the good ones, Paul. Oh, thank you for saying. I will say I thought my ed leadership program was very useful, and I thought there was a lot of good stuff in there. I don't think it was complete, and I do have other criticisms, but it was a very different experience than some other professional development, which is not connected to a master's, you know? So let's talk about your findings. And in particular, these three categories of levels of data availability that you had to sort of discern because it was so overwhelming, Paul. Like, I've always said this is not a political issue. I mean, I guess it is to some extent, but the lack of reporting, red, blue, and purple states, it was so amazing. So, describe your categories and your findings.
Yeah, so the categories, so we end up breaking states up into, we try to classify them based on how much data we're able to find about so remember, we're interested in teacher licensure rates and then teacher vacancy numbers. Um, and so we break, states up into, states where we can find that information in a relatively, recent, plausible, comprehensive way. States where it's somewhat less clear, maybe we can get some information. And states where we would describe the information we were looking for is not accessible. And we sort of assume if not accessible to us, it's not. We've tried pretty hard, and then it would be hard for anyone to get. I forget exactly the language we used around those, but we try to sort of put states into categories or tiers that way.
So, okay, so your first category was states where you had pretty reliable data sources, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we describe it as recent and clear. This was another challenge for us, right? Is what to do in a case where we could find some information, but it came from a report from a few years ago, for example. And that being a case where, it's not obvious how to interpret that information or how quickly it can go out of date, right? Particularly thinking about doing this, beginning this project relatively early in the pandemic and thinking about how rapidly the world can change. How do we handle that problem?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then the middle category, how would you describe that middle? Because most of the states fell into this middle category. Is this where you had to use news sources and not actual sources, like basically secondhand information? Is that the middle category?
I believe there are a few things that could get states into that sort of fuzzy category where we could get some information, but for example, it might not be about the entire state. So we might not be comfortable, for example, that the entire state was represented, or there could be some potentially conflicting information
Mm,
across. sources. So I don't think that was the only reason um, uh, they could end up in that sort of indeterminate category.
And then the bottom category, which is the entire West Coast. And the states sort of sprinkled all over the place from every political stripe. Those states, I want to know, were you surprised that so many states fell into those categories? Which specific states fell into those categories? Yeah, because it's just bizarre. I think it's really weird the variety of states in that bottom category.
Um, I don't know what it's too hard in retrospect to say what would I have predicted. I don't know that I had clear expectations, and if I did, I don't know that I would remember them correctly now in retrospect. I do think it's certainly interesting to me looking back how little rhyme or reason there was in terms of, what are those states going to be where we can't find any information about vacancies. I think you're right. I think it's on the one hand, yes, it's basically the West Coast, California up through Alaska, I think. And but on the other hand, we got states in the Midwest. We've got red states and blue states. We've got states on the East Coast and or at least in New England. I don't know if they like to be, I don't know how to classify that exactly. But I think so. I think and I think that speaks a little bit to some of the what can maybe that speaks a little bit to some what can sometimes be the sort of surprising politics of education and the way I don't know that but also I think it's just that again, these are vacancy data are data that in general states are not using. The federal government is generally not requiring be collected. Um, and so I think you end up with sometimes a little bit of a little bit of randomness around where the data are or are not collected. So I don't know. Yeah, I think it sounds like you were as struck by as we were by how kind of all over the place the data were.
I was so struck by it. And I guess I was more idealistic. I expected my state to be better than that, mainly because of Gavin Newsom's like very public declaration that he cares about the problem. But then I was like, of course it's this way. Of course it's this way because of the problem of local control. And when you even try to describe the problems in K-12, because it's so esoteric to people, they're like, wait, what? Like local control means that school districts have a lot of power over the ways our schools are governed, from choosing curriculums to hiring the superintendent. Like they just have a lot of power. And what I found so striking in how you guys chose to write this up was you got to the meat of it. You're like, the way they describe a vacancy, the way they report, like who they report to, like what they consider as a vacancy, and all of these other issues around sometimes principals want to hire someone straight out of, barely getting onto the credential pathway because it's cheaper because of step and column. It winds up being a lot cheaper to hire brand new people. So it's just very confusing. And how would you describe, if you had to sum it up, how local control impacts the limitations of your data?
So I think part of the way you see local control affecting things is we have a lot more complete data around teacher certification and whether they're fully certified. In fact, I'm not sure about this, but I think maybe it might be every state or almost every state where we were able to get something about teacher certification rates. And I think what I think that reflects in part is that is a place where the local control has been greatly reduced. That's a place where, states and the federal government in various ways have come in and said, oh, no, actually, you need to keep track of what licenses are held by people with each assignment and whether those licenses are aligned with those assignments. Whereas on the vacancy side of things, that's a place where school districts are left to their own devices. They actually probably do have most of them are aware of the fact that there are vacancies they need filling, right? They've got job boards, for example. They are actually trying to hire for those positions, but the way they document it is much more all over the place because of that local control that you said, that there's no one coming in and imposing a definition or imposing a collection requirement. And so in some cases, they might be collecting some things. In other cases, they're not.
Yeah, I mean, the depths of the lack of accountability was something I was primed to see because of me digging into really the cover up. I'm calling it a cover up of our national illiteracy problem. And then also the lack of implementation of Title IX in K-12. So, like these very foundational things, which I thought should be taken care of. Nobody even agreed that we had a problem. We had no common language to describe these problems. So, and I knew that was coming from local control. So local control means that we don't have a common set of vocabulary terms or priorities to get into digging into this problem. So I guess where I want to end is I would like for you to talk about what you think needs to happen going forward. Do you agree with us that a national professional association would help sort of standardize the way in which we talk about this and, give us a common language? What do you think contributes to the shortage even maybe? And like, who needs to see your data? Because I don't think people have seen it enough. I think it gets quoted by other people and taken out of context, and then people think they know what you've said and they don't really know. So I'll let you comment on all that.
It's you've characterized my experiences very well. I think this is one of those things where I think people have narratives that they are already sort of committed to a lot of times, and they interpret in good faith. I think they interpret in a lot of cases the same information interpreted differently by different people depending on sort of where they're coming at this from. So I'll say a couple of things. I think you had a couple of questions there. I'll start with the sort of what might help address some of the shortages. So, from my point of view, I think the variation in shortages is at least as big of an issue as the shortages in general. And what that means is essentially that these problems are localized in various ways. I have students who can post a open position and get dozens or even 100 applications for an open position. And I have students who will struggle to fill a position at all, to get applicants, period. And I think recognizing that variation in their experiences is important for understanding what we would need to do about it. And I think what we need are targeted solutions for targeted problems. And I think that in many cases, maybe it's because I have a bit of a background in economics, I think that has to do with money, and making sure that schools that have a harder time staffing their positions have more resources. Yeah, so I think the data is important for policymakers to see. I think some policymakers are in tune with the fact that we don't necessarily have perfect data here and that there is a lot of variation in shortages. And that's part of what we document in the paper. Nationwide is differences between states. That's part of what I document in Illinois is differences between school districts or even schools within school districts. And that understanding that variation, I think, matters because I think my experience is policymakers think very differently about the problem depending on whether they think of it as something that's affecting everybody the same way or whether they think about it as affecting specific school districts, specific schools, specific classrooms, specific teaching positions. And the extent to which, because I think, for policymakers, if they think it's affecting everyone equally, they tend to propose solutions that are what I think of as more of the same. Kind of, we need to increase the rate at which people are going into teacher preparation programs, for example. And I'm not sure that that's the best use of our resources because there are some classrooms and some positions and some districts we're already very good at getting people into, and pumping more people through those pipelines, I'm not convinced would help, for example. But when they are more aware of the kind of variation or the lack of information that we have about these things, the more they're inclined to say, okay, well, let's collect the information and then let's use it to target the solutions where they're needed. Whether that's creating new preparation programs that will serve fill the positions that we're not able to fill, or whether that means funding that goes disproportionately to the schools and districts that have the most vacancies. I'll just say, just frankly, that's what Illinois has done. And I think part of the rationale in Illinois for collecting more administrative statewide vacancy data is to then be able to use that data to say, okay, well, those are the districts that need help addressing shortages. Those are the positions where we need more teachers. Now let's take the money and let's take the resources and let's take the energy and put it into filling those positions rather than trying to spread it in some generic way across the state.
I suppose if, okay, so the idea you and I both have is differential pay, especially for SPED. But I think in BIPOC communities that are highly impacted with the shortage. But if you think about it like this, you have to reframe and respect veteran teachers, because it would attract veteran teachers if it had more pay. And we could move our best talent, which is presumably veteran teachers, not always, but move them into these other positions so they could be paid more. Because like right now, what teachers earn with their veteran status is the chiller vibe, right? I can take all AP classes. I can go to the districts that don't have climate and culture issues and just kind of coast on into retirement, because I'm not leading anything. No one expects me to lead anything. So I'm just going to kind of show up and have an easier go of it because I've done my time in those harder settings to begin with. But then the other issue is to look at why are those places not keeping and attracting talent, and to try to fix those problems, which is what we do in the podcast. We talk about why our profession is so unattractive at times and why specific places are in our field are unattractive, which is really a civil rights nightmare, because those students that need the best teachers because of historically marginalized insults to their learning, nothing, or just the very newest of us. You know what I mean? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think certainly what you're describing is borne out in the research pretty clearly, which is that if the pay is the same, then the more veteran teachers tend to move into the classrooms and the schools and the districts and the positions that they're going to find more attractive. And that often means, they want to work with higher achieving kids where there's fewer disciplinary issues and things like that. And they have no incentive to do anything else. And so that gets shown up in the data. And that means, the lower achieving kids, the kids who are marginalized the most, are also getting the most novice teachers. Now, I think I do probably tend to focus on compensation issues there. That's where I think the evidence is clearest about sort of what the interventions could be. But I think you're also right that there is also good evidence that things like working conditions and school leadership, which I sometimes lump in to the working conditions bucket, are really important for teachers. But that's a place where you all might have more to say than I do, because I think I would say in terms of the research evidence, that's a place where we have better evidence that those things matter for teachers over and above compensation. The working conditions they have, the quality of their leaders are really important for things like retention. What we don't have are really reliable ways of intervening to improve those things. At least that's how I would characterize the research on this, is that we know those things matter. But we don't know, for example, as someone who works in administrator preparation, it's very important to me to prepare the kinds of strong leaders that teachers say that they want to work in their schools, but I'm not always sure that I'm able to do that consistently and reliably. And I would love better evidence on things like, oh, how do you prepare school leaders to be the kinds of leaders that teachers want? How do you organize working conditions in ways that will reliably make teachers happier and want to work in the profession generally, and especially in those schools and positions that are hardest to staff?
I don't think site-based leadership is a humanizing position at all, Paul. I don't think that they have a job that is doable, manageable, and humanizing, and there's just too much pressure on them. I just think site-based leadership is just a really, really soul-sucking job for a number of reasons that we talk about in the podcast. And that is to say that I respect them. I didn't want that job. I looked at it and said, no thanks. But I think that the way to fix this, the way to get the solutions into these schools and into these places where the teacher shortage problem is so pronounced, is to elevate teachers' leadership, because we have firsthand knowledge of what's going on in these spaces, and we have solutions, but nobody asks our opinion. I mean, I'm just going out on a limb, Paul, and inserting the central thesis of the podcast into this interview. Leadership, visionary, innovation, these things are not curated in the minds of teachers. They're not, no one asks for their input. And so a lot of what gets done is very cursory. And what I say is ticking boxes by people who no longer have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on, you know. So this whole idea of creating a space where if you are a veteran and you want to do it and you've met whatever qualifications we decide you need to meet, you should be released from your teaching for part of your day to be in leadership. You shouldn't have to, I say, you shouldn't have to lead, you shouldn't have to leave our profession to lead it. So what are your thoughts about that? I know it's wacky, like it's so revolutionary, but like that's what I'm saying. What do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's wacky at all. It's certainly, well beyond the scope of my expertise in terms of, what kinds of benefits that would have, or even how you would organize it to sort of make it effective. But I think that might be certainly an interesting. I'd be curious, are there people you could talk to even for your podcast? I wonder if are there places in your experience that are trying more, I don't know if shared governance is quite the right word, but more of that integrating the teacher workforce and the administrative team in schools. Is that something you've seen happen to any degree?
No, I mean, we have TOSAs, but they're not paid more. They just make whatever they have on step and column, and they're basically implementers. And so, what I have found is that in places where we are doing a real cursory job of delivering quality education to the kids, and teachers develop self possession and have an opinion, they just kind of get shuffled around because their opinion complicates things, like with ELD instruction, SPED instruction, climate and culture issues. And so the it's a you're the annoying teacher in the room. Is like, but like we're working on our LCAPs. You know what LCAPs are? They have okay. Administrators sit down and they come up with this plan to improve your school in a few areas like learning-based outcomes, climate and culture, and they come up with these metrics to show how they're collecting their data and reflecting on it. And it's all just ticking boxes. Like one of the measures that we were supposed to be using to improve our reading levels was we were supposed to be all sitting down and reflecting on star reading data, and none of us had been trained to use star reading data. It was a new test we were using at the secondary level, and no one was being guided towards that process. Like it's all very superficial. And the extent to which that is like the problem here is, I think, probably jaw dropping to people.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think this is something where I'd be curious actually what like what teachers want, like what kinds of roles they want in administration. I think one question I'd have is sort of about even your experience of like are the types of roles, the leadership roles you're describing, are those interests that teachers share widely? Like you think they're leaving because their voice isn't heard, or I think because I think sometimes my instinct is almost like, well, we already ask teachers to do a lot. And is this something that now they feel like there's one more thing they need to do is also be on the leadership team?
No, they don't, they wouldn't have to, right? And so we would have to sit down and decide, okay, so if you're going to be a teacher evaluator, like if you observe teachers, because I think only teachers should be evaluating other teachers. And how many periods of release do you need for that? What qualifications do you need for that? Like in my idea and pie in the sky of having a national professional association, there would be some kind of liaison at the U.S. Department of Ed, and that would need to be one of us, and you would need to be released for 2 years even. But the thing is you need to stay tethered to the profession. Every year you're out of the classroom, you become relevant to a lot of these things a little less and less. I'm not saying there aren't administrators. I'm not saying there aren't school boards, but we're that check and balance, Paul. Like we're the judiciary. We are a lifetime appointment, and we can speak more freely, and we're missing, I guess is what I'm saying. Does that, I don't know, when I say these things, I always wonder how much sense am I making? Does it sound, I don't know. What do you
No,
think?
so I certainly, it's not, I think, totally a wacky idea by any means, but it certainly is different. than I think most schools are organized. And if I were going to be, if I wanted to put the most optimistic framing on local control in education as possible, I can imagine this being a case where this is a potential advantage of local control, as there might be places where locally this kind of thing can be implemented in a way that it can't be as easily, a statewide or nationwide or something. And so, maybe there are pockets of places that could try out something like this to to give us a sense for how helpful and effective it is.
Thank you. I think that wraps up our conversation for today. Would you be willing to come back on at another time to talk about other issues or this one even more?
Sure. Yeah.
Yay! What do you want to leave the listeners with? Any final thoughts?
I think I described what I think are the key points. I think just, that I'd reiterate is I think this is a place where the available evidence on, if we're talking about teacher shortages, I think, the available evidence is limited in a lot of important ways. And to the extent that we have evidence, and I think this is true about all the evidence we have, whether we're talking about vacancies, whether we're talking about teacher licensure, whether we're talking about teacher quality in some abstract sense, I think no matter how we define teacher shortage, something that is very consistent is that these are highly varied problems that are highly localized. They disproportionately affect kids who are educationally most disadvantaged already. They affect certain types of positions, certain geographies, and keeping that variation in mind, I think, is really key to addressing the shortages that exist. I think there are definitely pockets where it is a crisis. I think that's a perfectly plausible way of describing it, particularly in some of the most disadvantaged schools, which are also the ones where ideally I would like the services to be strongest.
Thank you, Paul. I so appreciate your time, and thank you for the research that you've done. And would you please pass it on to your colleagues? Your paper is awesome.
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you for listening to K12confidential.com, the podcast by teachers to all of America, as our urgent plea for radical reforms which will allow us to protect our precious and fragile democracy. Sign our petition at K-12confidential.com to stand up for a quality education for all of America's youth.